Welcome to the Red Sneaker Writers Podcast. News, interviews, and writing tips for people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them achieve it. Your host is the nationally best-selling author of more than 50 books, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. I hope you are all somewhere safe and warm. As you probably know, I'm recording this from Oklahoma, and it is seriously cold. I don't recall it ever being this cold. Rarely have I seen so much snow on the ground, but nonetheless, I realize that we are much better off than our neighbors to the south in Texas, who are dealing with water shortages and power outages. I had the power outage a month or so ago, but not this time, thank goodness, which is why I'm able to do this podcast on schedule, and I hope you're someplace safe and warm with plenty of water, too. Big changes are coming to this podcast, starting with the next episode. I promised you some big changes in the works, and they are happening. Starting with the next podcast episode, we're adding a video component to the podcast. Now, you can still listen to the podcast, get it the usual places, the all audio version. But if you'd like, you can actually see faces of people when they're saying these things. Watch it happening. See the guests when they're talking about it. Plus, we can add graphics and links to places of value. And I think it's going to be fun. And at least for people who are so inclined, it might add an extra addition to the pod. Now, if you're listening to the podcast in your car, don't get the video version. You don't need that when you're driving. But if you're someplace safe at home, think about visiting places where you can get the video version, which would be my website, obviously, williambernhardt.com, very imaginatively titled, or my YouTube channel, which is also brilliantly titled William Bernhardt, and some other places I think that I'll mention next time. Also changes. I mentioned last time that WriterCon has a whole new website design, and if you haven't checked that out, please do, because I think it's very clean and attractive and easier to navigate and find out what this conference is. WriterCon, of course, is our Labor Day weekend writers conference in Oklahoma City, but we're also streaming all the sessions on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, so you can watch it from home if you're not inclined to travel. For that matter, even if you're busy that weekend, you can watch all those sessions online after the fact. So, no good excuses for not trying to advance your career by learning what's going on and what you might be doing that you're not doing at WriterCon. And if you register now, you can get the early bird price, which will not be around forever. So please go take a look at the new website and send me an email. Let me know what you think of it. The guest of honor for this podcast episode is Nathan Bransford, author of How to Write a Novel. He's a former literary agent at Curtis Brown and a very respected and acclaimed mentor and teacher for writers everywhere. His blog on nathanbransford.com. Hey, his website's just as imaginative as mine. Anyway, that blog is one of the top blogs out there for writing. I mean, you should do the Red Sneaker newsletter first and foremost, but after you've got that in place, Nathan's blog is really good. He was on the podcast once before talking about how you can achieve your writing dream. We'll talk about writing more, but I also wanted to talk to him about the middle grade books that he's been writing all these years. But first, the news. The biggest news, in my opinion right now, is the announcement that Amazon is now allowing authors who are in their KDP program, Kindle Direct Publishing, in other words, self-published authors, to nominate books, presumably your own books, your ebooks, I should specify, for Kindle deals and Prime reading promotions. This is a great thing. Take it from somebody who's had these things on various occasions in the past. They are terrific for boosting sales and getting your books out there where people can find out about them. Now, just to be clear, the fact that you nominate a book doesn't guarantee that it's going to be chosen, but at least you're in the running. And, being something that in the past has been reserved just for big publishers with a lot of money to throw around, I think this is a tremendous thing. You can nominate 2 eligible titles at a time for Kindle deals, 1 eligible title at a time for Prime Reading. I actually knew about this at the time of the last podcast, but I wanted to actually do it and try it so I could report back to you and make sure it wasn't just kind of a pig in the poke thing. So I did this for some of the books we publish, and let me tell you, it works. Now we're still waiting to see if we're going to be chosen, but I know the nomination went through. Basically, they say, if you haven't heard from us in 90 days, then apply again. You haven't been chosen. Still, if you're able to get these kinds of promotions, they will make your book more visible, more discoverable on Amazon, which is where about 89% of all ebooks are sold right now. So obviously, this is a great thing. Go check it out. I wanted to say a little bit about morals clauses in writers' contracts. We've talked about this before, but there was a great article last week in the New York Times discussing it. It focuses on Penguin Random House, the largest publisher in the English-speaking world. But just to be clear, all of the big 5 publishers have so-called moral clauses in their contracts, and a lot of smaller publishers as well. Just to be clear, the morals clause is probably poorly named because it's not really suggesting that you have to be a wonderful, perfect person to be published. What it does say is that if you do something that damages your reputation, they have an escape clause. They have a valid contractual reason to not publish your book. And who makes the determination whether you've hurt your own reputation? The publisher, of course. They've always got all the power. This was, you remember a couple weeks back, I mentioned that Josh Hawley's book had been canceled by a major publisher in the wake of his perceived participation in the rioting at the U.S. Capitol building. This is how they did it, by accessing the morals clause and saying basically this has damaged your reputation and we don't want to be associated with it. This is exactly what Ballantine Books, which is a division of Penguin Random House, used. You may remember a few years back, Paula Deen got into some trouble with some remarks she admitted she had made well in the past that were perceived as racist, and that's how they canceled her book contracts. I mention it because you need to be careful. I know you're all good people, that's why you're writers, but still, we live in extremely sensitive times, and I don't know how they do it, but people seem to be able to dig up tweets from 10 years ago or rando comments that you might have made in front of somewhere that somebody caught on video or whatever. You need to be careful. Yeah, be active on social media. That's how you build audiences for your books, but don't say anything that anybody could even conceivably take in a wrong way, especially to be racist or sexist or anti-LGBTQ or anything else like that. Be active, but be careful. We have some data for the first time from the Census Bureau relating to book sales. As I've reported before, and it's still true, don't worry, book sales increased dramatically last year, especially for ebooks, but also for print books as well. It's clear that during the lockdown, people were reading more. But what the Census Bureau information tells us is that book sales in bookstores were down. In fact, overall, they were down about 20%. So you may be asking yourself, how can this be? How can book sales go up, but bookstore sales go down? Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it? The shift to online shopping last year was dramatic. Now, there were reasons for that, to be sure. A lot of bookstores were closed for much of the year. Libraries even were closed. But still, it is clear that some people have discovered and even embraced online shopping. What does that portend for the future of bookstores? I don't know. It's probably not promising. For that matter, it has great ramifications for how long the big 5 publishers can survive and how books are going to be promoted in the future. Other people have noticed what a slow turnover there has been recently in the books on the New York Times list. I mean, you look at it maybe you don't, I do, look at it every week and think, well, first I think, where's my book? And then second, I think, these are the same books that were there last year. Where are the crawdads saying, yeah, it's apparently perennial? Well, to some extent, that is because people aren't discovering new books, at least not big five books. And part of the reason they're not discovering new books may be because they're not going to the bookstore where you see things on the end caps or on the alleged bestseller lists, and people browse sometimes for hours and discover new books. I have to say, I think new books are still being discovered, but they're being discovered online. And since more than 50% of all books are sold at Amazon, and how many ebooks, the percentage, I've read people saying it's between 80 to 90%, higher for genre fiction. I've heard some people say as far as 89%. At any rate, a huge percentage of ebooks are sold on Amazon. That's where people are discovering new authors. And that's why, folding back to that first story, things like Kindle deals and Prime reading deals can be so important. These are the algorithms that Amazon is using to decide what books to thrust in front of people when they do searches, or when they, ask to look at one book and then you show them 10 others underneath it. Now, Amazon ads can have a big impact on that too. But my bottom line here is that discoverability isn't changing. It isn't going away. It's just changing its location, which of course only makes sense. If people are purchasing more online, then that's where they're going to discover new books as well. Bottom line, my friends, the world of books is very much changing. And if you want to stay active in this business, you need to be aware of what's happening now. For my writing tips section, I want to address something that some people are going to argue is not actually about writing, because we're going to be talking about getting an agent, or specifically what agents not to get. But I think it has a great deal to do with writing. Certainly, maybe not when you're writing your book, but when you're trying to get it out there. I know one of the big draws at WriterCon and other writer conferences for people is the chance to speak to an agent. And people's belief that if they meet someone face-to-face, they're much more likely to land an agent than if they just send out queries, which is absolutely true. But, again, I'm urging caution, because all agents are not alike. Now, you're going to think I'm bragging about my own conference, and I am, but for legitimate reasons. I completely vet every agent who gets invited to WriterCon. I don't invite anybody I don't know, I don't trust, and I don't invite anybody that I wouldn't be happy to have for my own agent, which is pretty tough standard. I have been to other conferences where standards were lower, and I'm really not blaming anybody. I think sometimes conferences are organized by people who aren't active in the publishing world, maybe haven't published or had agents or know a lot of people. And so they get, email from people offering themselves as an agent as a conference. And so they say, yes, of course, great, problem solved. The problem is that some of those people are not going to be the world's greatest agent. In fact, some of them that I've seen have no legitimacy, no sales, no clients at all. They are just going to conferences and collecting speakers' fees. Agents should not be making their money off speaking fees. They should be making their money by selling people's books. There is a great post right now on Writer Beware. That's a website. Go check it out, Writer Beware, that addresses with a specific case how to avoid disreputable, in some cases even scam agencies that haven't actually sold anything but are just collecting fees from agents. So here's my checklist of things to look out for. Did I say from agents? I meant from authors, collecting fees from authors. Here's my checklist. And big surprise, that is number one on the list. 1, if this alleged agent is charging a fee to consider looking at your manuscript, forget it. Move on. That's not who you want. In the first place, that is not how agents make money. That is not legitimate. In the second place, since there are hundreds of agents who don't charge fees, why? There is no reason to do that. They're not the most successful. They're not the most predominant. So why? That makes no sense. I don't care if they're calling that fee a marketing fee or a reading fee or some kind of feedback analysis fee, whatever. If they're charging a fee, forget it. That's not how tippy-top best agents do it. Second, look around at the bios. Do their bios cite any kind of publishing or agenting experience? If they don't, beware. That's probably not who you want. Are they making vague claims that you really can't verify, things that are more puffing than substantial? Go someplace else. What you should be able to find out with very little trouble from any agent is, who are the clients? Do they have a client list? What sales have they made in the past? That should be right there and ready for you to see on their internet page, which is the third item on my list. If they don't have an internet presence, I'm sorry, but forget it. That is how people do business today. I don't care if they're 20 or 80 businesses that don't have an internet presence, you should be suspicious of right off the bat. That's how people are getting submissions. That's how people establish their legitimacy. If you can't find a website for that agent, move on. Now, I'm aware that all agents have to start somewhere. And if they're just starting on the business, they may not have an exhaustive client list. But typically, those starter agents are going to be in some larger agency or firm, someplace where they can learn the business. On the other hand, if you're looking at somebody who is their own firm or has some nebulous firm name that you can't find out anything about, and you can't find any client list, and you can't find any sales list, you should move on in all likelihood. If you're meeting them in person, ask, who are your clients? And if they start hedging, forget it, move on. I understand the desperation to get an agent. I've been there. It's been a while, but I remember decades ago, boy, this is dating me back in the 80s. I spent 2 years trying to get an agent, and it's hard to be patient and avoid scammers and avoid vanity presses and stick to your guns. But let me tell you, it's worth it. The publishing world today has more opportunities for authors than it's ever had before. So don't throw those away. If you want to go the traditional route and you want an agent, that is fine. But make sure you're getting an agent who is worth having. My interview this time is with Nathan Bransford, very famous author of How to Write a Novel and teacher and mentor, but he's also written a series of middle grade books featuring the character Jacob Wunderbar. Maybe you should say that Wunderbar. I don't know. But anyway, Jacob Wunderbar and the cosmic space kapow and so forth. So I wanted to talk about writing, but I wanted to hear a little bit about that too. Here's what he had to say. Nathan, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
Just to give everyone the quick sketch background, you once upon a time were an agent at Curtis Brown. You've written several books, including a great series of middle grade books, and you work as a writer's coach, apparently very successfully, because I know there are a lot of people giving you endorsements and thanking you for all your help. I wanted to talk a little bit about publishing today. I know you've written a guide, you've written several, How to Write a Novel and also How to Publish a Book. Today's publishing world's a little bit more complicated than it was once upon a time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot. I mean, from an author's perspective, it's good because there are a lot more avenues. But yeah, it's certainly a little bit more complicated to navigate.
I agree. I like the fact that authors have more than one path and possibility of profiting more from their own work. But it doesn't make it harder for people to decide which way they want to go. How do you coach your aspiring writers about publishing?
Yeah, I mean, it really just depends on your goals as a writer and what you ultimately want to accomplish out of your and get out of your publishing journey. So some of the pros of traditional publication is the cachet that comes along with traditional publishing, the distribution. It's very hard to get into a bookstore by self-publishing. And there are professionals who are helping you manage the process at every stage of every stage. And with self-publishing, but the cons of traditional publishing is that it can take an extremely long time to find an agent. It can take an extremely long time to find a publisher, even after you have an agent. So the process can really be drawn out. And you also cede some control. You're not likely to have control over your cover. There are editorial decisions that you'll need to navigate, and so you do give up a little bit of control over the process when you go traditional. With self-publishing, you can finish a book and get it available for sale a couple of weeks later. If you move really quickly, you could retain control over your cover. You can pursue your own vision. You can write the book that you really want to write. You don't need to worry quite as much about writing a book that is outside of the traditional genres that traditional publishers might kind of want to shoehorn you into. But it requires a lot of entrepreneurialism, and you need to be able to either manage certain facets of the process yourself or find people to help you. And so it does require kind of a business mind, I think. And I think, of course, the trickiest part at the end of the day is the marketing. You have to find some way of getting those first readers who will then help propel your book through word of mouth. And now there's even a third option, which is hybrid publishing, which kind of combines some elements of traditional and self-publishing. And the advantage there is that there are people helping you. The disadvantage is that there are only really a few hybrid presses who probably can do a whole lot more than you can do on your own self-publishing. But there are hybrid publishers that are very genuine value adds. So yeah, it kind of just comes down to what's ultimately important to you out of those pros and cons. And there's also nothing to say that you can't start with trying with traditional publishing. If you strike out, move on to self-publishing or hybrid publishing. So lots of different avenues available.
That's what I often tell people who I see in writing retreats and conferences and whatnot, who, if person is a certain age, which I guess I could admit I am, since my first book was published in 1991, you may have that predisposition that traditional publishing is the king. That's the best. That's where the real people are. And so they just, whether it makes any logical sense or not, can't get it out of their system, right? And so I advise those people to, go for it, but give yourself a time limit. Don't spend the rest of your life waiting to get that agent.
Yeah, absolutely. And one doesn't preclude the other. I mean, I had a traditional publisher for my Jacob Wonderbar series, and I self-published my guides to writing and publishing. And I enjoyed both processes. They both sold pretty much the same amount. I mean, sometimes traditional publishing will make sense for one project and not for another project, and you just kind of got to take it one step at a time, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's break this down if we can. So let's say somebody wants to go traditional publishing. Mm-hmm. If they're shooting for the big presses, they're probably going to need an agent. You used to be an agent, for Pete's sake. Tell the people how to get an agent.
Yeah, well, usually it starts with writing a really good query letter, and even if you know people in the business, even if you know other writers, you still should try to write a really good query letter. And at essence, a query letter is a brief 250 to 350 word letter that gives a 2 to 3 paragraph plot summary along with your bio. And it's the real key thing in the query letter is the plot summary. That is the thing that you really want to focus on making as strong as possible. And so once you've written a really strong query letter, and I have a lot of advice on how to write a query letter, examples of good query letters on my blog, which is nathanbransford.com/blog.
Blog.
Oh, thank you. I recommend, spending time researching agents. Create a spreadsheet. Start researching agents who represent your genre, the agents who represent your favorite books. Take notes about them. Note their submission procedure, their email addresses, and the books that they've represented. And familiarize yourself with them. There's so much more opportunity now to kind of get to know agents and kind of get a sense of their personality and taste, whether it's through their Twitter account or interviews they've done. And just build up a database of agents, begin to kind of rank them based on who your gut is telling you is maybe most likely to gravitate toward your work. And I recommend that authors send out queries about 7 to 10 at a time. And the reason for this is that it balances, not waiting forever and going one at a time, because agents can take a very long time to respond. And so you don't want to go one at a time. But if you have 7 to 10 out at any given time, it gives you some flexibility to adjust your approach if it's not working. So if you strike out after the first 10 to 15 agents and you're not getting requests to see your manuscript, you may want to adjust your approach. And if you don't send it out to 50 to 100 right off the bat, you still have that kind of flexibility with the remaining people on your list to kind of keep course correcting as you go along. So to me, that's kind of the sweet spot, is kind of, 7 to 10. If you receive a rejection, send out a new one. If you don't hear from somebody in 2 months, send out a new one. And then hopefully you receive an offer of representation and the instant bestsellerdom, which happens so rarely, but we all want it.
That's really good advice, which I'm not sure I had 30 years ago or whenever I was first trying to get an agent. I'd send out 10 and everybody'd reject them. And then I'd think, well, stupid agents, and then send the same letter out again. Tweaking it before you do the next round makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
I've seen people struggle with query letters for weeks. How much detail should they go into in the plot summary, or what should be emphasized? I mean, it's a problem of you get into this morass of this happens and then this happens, and nobody can really follow that when they haven't read the book. What do you?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is so tricky. And to me, there's a real art to writing a query letter. Mm-hmm. And the key is first sticking to, well, first of all, your overall, let's go start with the goal. The goal with the plot description in the query letter is to give an agent a sense of the plot, but also, I think, give a sense of what it's like to read your novel. So you want to make sure the agent can wrap their head around the plot, and the experience of reading the query should feel like the experience of reading your book. So it should be in the voice of your book. Now, that doesn't mean it needs to be first person. If you write a first person narrative, that's not quite what I mean, but just that the sensibility and flavor should be coming through. And so the key thing here is to summarize. Definitely, you have to kind of pick and choose different elements of the plot to focus on. But the overall arc of the characters, the protagonist's journey should come through. And the way to make a query really come alive is to take vague turns of phrase and make them much more specific. And so some people will say, so-and-so is dreams of success at work or something like that. And that's fine, but so-and-so will murder someone for the corner office is much more vivid and tells us a lot more about the character. And so a lot of people get hung up because they write these very, very vague query letters that stick to this abstract summary that could really be about anybody. But if you just take those vague turns of phrase, like is ambitious, and then swap in something much more vivid and much more true, much more specific to the world of the novel, that's what I think will really make the query letter come alive.
That is really good advice. Another thing you mentioned when you were talking about people going for traditional publishing is that you give up control. You're also giving up your publishing rights, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. No, definitely. And these days, especially. So when you sign a publishing contract, typically it's for the term of copyright. And in the past, there are reversion clauses in the contracts, which means that there's certain thresholds that if the book goes out of print for a certain length of time, or it varied from contract to contract, but you would be able to get the rights back. But these days, with ebook sales, a book never really truly goes out of print. And publishers, of course, want to hang on to the rights as long as they can, because they can benefit from that long tail if you aggregate that over the course, over thousands of books. And so, so you do lose a lot of flexibility there. Your rights may be tied up with a publisher who may not be actively promoting it and may not be doing anything for you. And, so it can be that certainly can be a consideration. At minimum, really talk to your agent, make sure you understand the reversion clause, because that's something that can be really important for your future.
Yes, take it from me, kids. It really can be. I've got some books from the 90s I would really like to get the rights back to.
Yeah, can you imagine just being able to self-publish them again? And it just changes your incentive structure for promotion and things like that. So definitely.
Now, on the self-publishing side, you talked about bookstores, which is definitely a consideration, because your odds are better, though not guaranteed, of getting in bookstores if you're traditionally published. Are there ways self-published authors can get into bookstores?
Yeah, typically it happens by personal relationships with booksellers in your area, making personal connections. It also is helpful to have some distribution, probably most likely through Ingram Spark, which when you self-publish through Ingram Spark, it's available in sort of Ingram's database, which bookstores are very familiar with stocking books through, and so they're a little bit more comfortable with that avenue than with Kindle Direct Publishing and Amazon. So if that is important to you, I would recommend that. But it's still really tricky as a self-published author to get significant pickup through bookstores. At the end of the day, bookstores tend to be both more used to working with the traditional publishing distribution, and tend to be a little bit skeptical about the quality of self-published books. And so it's a little bit of an uphill climb there, but it does happen.
You can, at least with that account at Ingram, make it possible for bookstores to order the way they're used to. And what they ever do is probably up to the author.
Right.
Any marketing advice? I know that should be like the subject of a whole different interview, but in one minute or less, what do you recommend people do?
There are a lot of people out there, who have formulas and say you have to do X, Y, and Z. And if you follow my formula, then you're going to be a bestseller, or you're going to sell gazillions of copies. I don't believe that there's a formula. I think it really comes down to the individual author. And what I recommend that people do is just hone in on the 1 to 2 or 3 things that you both enjoy doing and are best at. And there are a lot of different ways to market a book. I think I have a post on my blog that's like 32 different ideas for marketing a book, and that's a significant undercount. I mean, they're just general ideas. And if you enjoy getting into the weeds of digital advertising and Facebook ads and Amazon ads, then do that. If you have connections in local media or national media, and you're good on TV, then do that. If you enjoy in-person events, in-person events in a normal world, then do that. And so just hone in on what you actually enjoy doing. So for me personally, my passion is online community. So I focus my energy on my blog and my social media presence. And that's my thing. And, but other people have done very successful, offline promotions. And so there's no formula. Just don't try and do everything, because you'll end up with a great nothing, basically.
That's good advice. Nathan, thanks for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks again.
Thanks again, Nathan, for that terrific interview. Just remind everyone, stay tuned. Keep watching for the next video episode of this podcast, which will be released on March 7. Now, those of you who are subscribing to this podcast, you'll still get the audio version. And you can look at the show notes for that, punch details or whatever it is on your podcast app, and and read the notes, and you will see website links where you can find the video version. But I'll tell you at least two of them right now are going to be my website, williambernhardt.com, where there's already a page for the podcast, and my YouTube page, which will probably get it the instant it is released. And you should be subscribing to that anyway, because why not? I promise I will not be issuing a deluge of videos. But if you'd like to sit down for 30 minutes or so and watch the video version of the podcast, that's how you can do it. And check out that new WriterCon website as well. The web address is writercon.org. That's WRITERCON.org. Until next time, hey, keep writing. Stay warm, but keep writing. And remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit.